Ban the protest? No way.
We won't be silenced! Right to protest, Article 11! This is not China! Freedom! No to bans! Democracy now!
Britain has reached one of those moments. The kind where a sentence lands and doesn't just sit there, it divides the room. Keir Starmer has suggested that some protests may need to be banned, not restricted, not monitored, not better managed, banned. And that word hits differently because Britain likes to believe it has two things locked in, freedom and order. But every now and then, those two start arguing why this conversation is happening now. Let's not pretend this came out of nowhere. This follows a series of attacks against Jewish people in London, including the stabbing in Golders Green, which police are treating as terrorism. 2 men injured, a synagogue turned into a crime scene, and suddenly the conversation shifts from rights to risk. Because when violence begins to orbit around protest movements, even loosely, the question changes. It's no longer, should people be allowed to protest? It becomes, when does protest become a platform for something else? The line everyone talks about, but no one defines. Here's the problem. Everyone agrees there's a line. Almost no one agrees where it is. Peaceful protest? Protected. That's the baseline. But what about protests that incite hostility, create environments where violence becomes more likely, attract individuals or factions with more extreme intentions? At what point does a protest stop being expression and start becoming infrastructure? Because that's the real fear, not just what is said at protests, but what grows around them. Starmer's position, power thinking like power. Starmer isn't speaking like an activist. He's speaking like a head of government. And governments don't deal in ideals alone. They deal in consequences. If intelligence, policing, and security assessments suggest certain protests are consistently linked to risk, then from a government perspective, the logic becomes simple. Remove the risk, even if that means restricting the platform. That's not ideological, that's operational. The public split. Now, let's be honest. The public is not united on this. One side hears ban protests and thinks finally someone is taking this seriously. The other side hears it and thinks this is how freedoms get chipped away. Both reactions are real, both reactions have logic, and both are reacting to different fears. Fear of violence versus fear of control. This is the core tension. Fear of violence versus fear of state overreach. One side is asking, how many incidents do we tolerate before acting? The other is asking, what happens when the state decides which voices are allowed? And here's the uncomfortable truth. Both questions matter. The association problem. Now we get into dangerous territory. All activist groups that have links to known violent groups need to be banned. It sounds clean, decisive, but here's the problem. What counts as a link? Direct funding, shared members, loose ideological overlap, someone attending both events? Because the broader that definition becomes, the more power the state has to shut things down. And once that power exists, it doesn't stay perfectly targeted. It expands. Historically, it always does. The intelligence angle. Now let's address the part people don't say out loud. Yes, some groups do receive external funding. Yes, foreign influence exists. Yes, states and organizations attempt to shape narratives abroad. That's not conspiracy. That's geopolitics. But proving those links in a way that justifies banning a protest, that's a completely different standard. Because in a democratic system, action requires evidence, not suspicion, not pattern recognition alone, evidence. The slippery expansion. Here's the risk. If the government starts banning protests based on perceived links or influence, where does it stop? Today, groups linked to violence. Tomorrow, groups accused of risk. Next year, groups that are simply inconvenient. That's the slope. And it's not theoretical, it's historical. But ignoring the problem isn't an option either. Now let's flip it, because the other extreme is just as dangerous, pretending all protests are harmless, ignoring the fact that some gatherings escalate tension, attract extremists, create flashpoints. That's not freedom, that's denial. And denial doesn't prevent violence, it delays it.
Will the UK eventually ban all protests? A question for 2030. Protest is not a crime. Yet.
Britain's current mood. Right now, Britain is tense. Terror threat level raised. Targeted attacks happening. Communities feeling exposed. And in that environment, tolerance for risk drops. Fast. What might have been accepted 6 months ago suddenly feels unacceptable. That's not hypocrisy. That's human reaction. The government's calculation. So here's the calculation Starmer is making. If even a small number of protests are acting as catalysts for violence, then allowing them carries a cost, a real cost, measured in safety, trust, and public confidence. And governments are judged on one thing above all else. Can you keep people safe? The danger of absolutes, but here's where your argument needs sharpening. All groups with links should be banned. That's an absolute. And absolutes in policy are dangerous because reality is messy. Connections are not always clear. Influence is not always direct. Responsibility is not always shared. So a blanket approach risks hitting the guilty and the innocent at the same time. What actually works, if you want a system that holds up, it has to be specific evidence-based, targeted, not broad, not vague, not driven by fear alone, because fear produces blunt tools, and blunt tools break things they're not meant to hit. The real question. This is the question Britain is now facing. Do you protect freedom at the risk of instability, or do you restrict freedom to reduce risk? There is no perfect answer, only trade-offs. Keir Starmer has opened a door, not fully, but enough. A door to the idea that some protests may no longer be acceptable in the name of public safety. And once that idea is in the room, it doesn't leave easily, because every future incident will push that door wider. Every act of violence will be used as justification. Every moment of tension will make restriction feel more reasonable. And here's the truth most people don't want to say clearly. You cannot have absolute freedom of protest in a world where some people use that freedom as cover for harm. But you also cannot give the state unlimited power to decide which protests are allowed without eventually paying a different price. A quieter one, a slower one, but a real one. So Britain is now standing on a line, not a legal one, a philosophical one, between liberty and control, between trust in the public and trust in the state. And whichever direction it moves, it won't just affect protests. It will define what kind of country this is becoming. Because banning a protest is never just about the protest. It's about who gets to speak, who gets to gather, and who gets to decide when that stops. And once that power is used, it doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the system, waiting for the next moment someone decides it's necessary again.